Hi. So this is the extra video that I mentioned of examples of ways in which the disciples begin to act like the Pharisees and begin to have hard hearts like the Pharisees. So this was a really fascinating thing for me to look at, and it ended up with me being very geeky and sort of color coding the first half of the Gospel of Mark and going through it. Um, And I found it really fascinating. So the opening of Mark describes the Pharisees of having hard hearts, and I started to notice ways in which the disciples gradually get harder and harder of heart, and that's a phrase that you might recognize as well from the Exodus story. This is how Pharaoh is described as being sort of blind to the things of God, and that idea is a really important one, and it's an idea that Jesus fleshes out near the beginning of Mark, in Mark chapter 4. So the disciples, he's just told the parable of the sower. And the disciples ask Jesus why he teaches in parables. And he tells them that many people think everything is a parable. They think everything is kind of this story with an underlying meaning that they can't quite grasp. As a kind of a chasing after something they can never possess. And this is how the Pharisees treat God, right? As an object they don't deserve and can never have because they don't quite understand the good news of the kingdom. For them, it's like hearing a parable that they can't quite untangle. They fail to see the God behind the ritual, basically. And Jesus says in Mark 4, it's a fascinating passage, that he teaches in parables to kind of weed out the people who will hear it for what it really is, and the people who just think, oh, it's something I can never grasp. And we first see this happening way back in chapter 3. Jesus is accused, when he's cast out that first unclean spirit, he's accused of being able to cast out unclean spirits by virtue of himself being a demon. Now, he rejects these claims, saying, how can Satan cast out Satan? That doesn't make any sense. Read what Mark says about his answer. He says that his answer is a parable. In other words, it's a story that the people listening don't understand. Actually, its meaning seems quite clear, but they hear it as a parable. And as we progress through the story, as we progress through the gospel, Jesus becomes increasingly concerned that his disciples aren't getting it. They're viewing the events that are unfolding around them like parables that they don't understand. And it has an effect on what he's able to do. So right after raising the dead girl, Jesus visits his hometown. And he's unable to do many miracles because his own family and friends don't believe that he can. So interestingly, earlier in Mark chapter 3, Jesus has this interesting conversation where he declares that his disciples are his family now. Like, he says, well, who are my mother and my brothers? These guys are, right? And then he goes to his hometown, and his actual family, his biological family, and all his friends that he's grown up with don't believe that he is who he says he is, or that he is bringing the good news that he says he's bringing. And as a result of that, it says that he can't do very much there except for a few healings, right? Which, I'd be quite happy with that personally. But this is Jesus we're talking about. And you're reading it and you're like, hang on, this is Jesus and something is hindering him. How can anything hinder Jesus? The lack of faith in what's possible from those around him is what hinders him. And maybe there's a hint that when he says that his disciples are now his family, is there a hint that they are also about to do the same thing? And is that also a message to us, his church? When we doubt the volatility, the veracity, the life-giving nature of the good news, is Jesus' power limited? So after that, he feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's one of the most famous Bible stories. But Mark says that the disciples don't understand about the loaves, right? So he was just feeding people. They don't understand about the loaves. In other words, they think it's some kind of parable that they're not getting. And again, it says their hearts are hardened. How the Pharisees are described. And then we have this discussion in Mark 7 that we looked at on clean and unclean things. Have a look at verse 17 of Mark 7. The disciples ask him about the parable he's just told. And Jesus is tearing his hair out. He's like, I cannot believe you don't understand. Why do they think what he's saying is a parable? And next, another unclean spirit, yet another unclean spirit, is cast out to a woman. And then a deaf man is healed. But when he's healing the deaf man, Jesus groans while doing so. It's almost like he's beginning to struggle with the lack of faith around him. Next, he feeds 4,000 people. This is a story that I think you only get in Mark. So you have the feeding of the 5,000, and then a bit later you have the feeding of the 4,000. And he warns the disciples they've been infected with the yeast of the Pharisees. And again, they don't understand, and they think it's a parable. But what's really going on? What is the message? Why does Mark include this story? Well, previously, Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And they had 12 baskets of leftovers. And here he feeds 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few fish. No, it's not specific. And they had 7 baskets of leftovers. Now, I've been doing a lot of homeschooling with my kids, so my maths is on fire at the moment. Now, compared to 2 chapters earlier, Jesus is now taking more resources, 7 loaves and a few fish, compared to 5 loaves and 2 fish, to feed fewer people, 4,000 instead of 5,000, and has less left over. 7 baskets as opposed to 12. He's taking more resources to feed fewer people and has less left over. The disciples are beginning to affect the impact of the kingdom of God. The good news is being diluted by their acting in the same way as the Pharisees. Next, Jesus heals a blind man, but it takes him 2 attempts. Let me say that again. It takes Jesus 2 attempts to heal someone. Something is going badly wrong. We have a conversation where Jesus rebukes Peter as acting like Satan. And we have the transfiguration, this glorious moment that the disciples don't understand, right? And then we have that final unclean spirit moment. All of this kind of adds up to the disciples drifting into this way of thinking that is poisonous to the mission. And ultimately, it ends up with Jesus on the cross. There is good news, because Jesus doesn't stay on the cross. The good news is found in a very weird little story at the end of Mark. That this kind of restoration of humanity as not only able to approach God, but made holy by the approach of God, and then able to take that out into the world, that the mission hasn't failed. And the story is a very odd little one. At the end of the gospel, there's this incident when Jesus is arrested, when a young man is in the garden when Jesus is arrested. It says he runs away naked. And everyone's like, what's going on here? What is that about? Here's what I think it's about. Who do you immediately think of in the Bible when you hear that they ran away because they were naked? You think of Adam and Eve. You think of the archetypal human beings, the ones who represent all of us, the ones who fail as we all fail, the ones who fail as the disciples fail. And they run and they hide because they are naked. And I think that this young man at the end of Mark is representative of the disciples, but also of all of us. Failing where Jesus succeeds. But there is hope. Because Jesus dies on the cross and he is resurrected. And when the disciples reach the tomb, what do they see at the tomb? They see a young man, same phrasing, by the way, as the young man who ran away in the garden. They see a young man robed in white, sitting on the tomb proclaiming the good news. Not an angel in Mark. It's a young man. I think it's restored humanity. It's a humanity that makes the disciples think this is possible. And as I said, they go on in the book of Acts to show just what is possible. So I hope you found that helpful, and I hope you have some great conversations about it in your life groups. Cheers.